Let's look at the pretext for the U.S.-British aggression in Iraq, the supreme international crime that encompasses everything that follows. The pretext was the right of what's called anticipatory self-defense. Now it's sometimes called preemptive war, in a radical perversion of that concept. This right of anticipatory self-defense was proclaimed officially in the Bush administration National Security Strategy of September 2002, which declared Washington's right to resort to force to eliminate any potential challenge to its global dominance, any potential threat, if you like. The National Security Strategy was very widely criticized among the foreign policy elite right away. There was an article within weeks in the main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, which warned that what it called the new Imperial Grand Strategy could be very dangerous for the United States. And the criticism continued, again at a completely unprecedented level, right in the core of the mainstream, but on very narrow grounds. It was not that the doctrine was wrong, but rather its style and manner of implementation. Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, she summed up the criticism pretty accurately, also in Foreign Affairs, it's main establishment journal. She pointed out that every president has such a doctrine, but keeps it in his back pocket, and it's simply foolish to smash people in the face with it and to implement it in a manner that's going to infuriate even allies. That's threatening to U.S. interests and therefore wrong. Albright knew, of course, that Clinton had a similar doctrine. The Clinton doctrine, I'll quote it, advocated unilateral use of military power to defend vital interests, such as ensuring uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. That's without even the pretexts that Bush and Blair devised. You take it literally, the Clinton doctrine is more expansive than Bush's national security strategy. But unlike the Bush strategy, the more expansive Clinton doctrine was barely even reported. In fact, I'm not sure it was reported at all, and not criticized. And the reason is it was presented with the right style and implemented less brazenly. That's the way you should do it if you're looking for a career in diplomacy. Henry Kissinger described the Bush doctrine as, in his words, revolutionary. He pointed out that it undermines the 17th Westphalian system of international order and sovereignty, and of course he didn't even bother mentioning it. It undermines the UN Charter and current international law. Kissinger approved of the doctrine, but with reservations, the usual reservations about style and tactics, and with a crucial qualification. He said it cannot be a universal principle available to every nation. Rather, the right of aggression must be reserved to the United States, perhaps delegated to chosen clients. So we must forcefully reject the principle of universality, the principle that we apply to ourselves, the same standards we apply to others, more stringent ones if we're serious. Bush and Blair, who we're told read the Gospels religiously all the time, must know the famous definition of the hypocrite in the Gospels, repeated a couple of times, but maybe it didn't get from the eyes to what lies behind or whatever. And Kissinger, I think, is to be praised as often for his honesty in very forthrightly articulating the prevailing doctrines, which are usually concealed in professions of virtuous intent and tortured legalisms. And Kissinger also understands his educated audience. As he doubtless expected, there was no reaction. Well, his understanding of his audience was illustrated again rather dramatically just a couple of months ago, last May. Some Kissinger-Nixon tapes were released over Kissinger's strong objections. And there was a report in the world's leading journal, New York Times. The report mentioned in passing the orders to bomb Cambodia that Kissinger transmitted from Nixon to the military commanders. In his word, a massive bombing campaign in Cambodia, anything that flies on anything that moves. You get that? Anything that flies on anything that moves. Well, I think that's unique in the archival record. At least I've never come across a call for genocide in such explicit terms. The publication, we'd certainly call it genocide if anybody else were responsible. And this is a call for it. The publication elicited no reaction. That incidentally refutes Dean Coe of the Yale Law School. It is simply taken for granted in the elite intellectual culture that the president and his national security advisor do have the right to order genocide, contrary to Coe's outraged claim. Well, just imagine if the prosecutors at the Milosevic tribunal could find anything even remotely similar. They'd be overjoyed. Trial would be over, several life sentences, death penalty if it adhered to U.S. law. But remember, that's them, not us. And the difference is a core principle of the elite intellectual culture in the West, and in fact, throughout history rather generally, if you look. The principle of universality is the most elementary of moral truisms. It's the foundation of just war theory and, in fact, of every system of morality, which is why it is repeated over and over again in the Gospels. Rejection of moral truisms is a fundamental principle of intellectual culture, so deeply rooted as to be invisible. And just to illustrate again how deeply entrenched it is, that's the world in which we live, incidentally. It's not some exotic thing on Mars. Let's return to the principle of anticipatory self-defense, which is adopted as legitimate by both political organizations in the United States and across virtually the entire spectrum of articulate opinion, that's usual margins. The principle has some immediate corollaries. So if the United States is granted the right of anticipatory self-defense against terror, then certainly Cuba, Nicaragua, in fact a long host of others, have been entitled for years to carry out terrorist acts within the United States, because there's no doubt about U.S. involvement in very serious terrorist attacks against them, extensively documented in impeccable sources. In the case of Nicaragua, even condemned by the World Court and the Security Council in 2 resolutions that the U.S. vetoed, with Britain loyally abstaining. The conclusion that Cuba and Nicaragua, among many others, have long had the right to carry out terrorist atrocities in the U.S., that conclusion is, of course, utterly outrageous and advocated by no one. And thanks to our own self-determined immunity from moral truisms, there's no fear that anyone will draw the outrageous conclusions that follow from our doctrines. And there are actually still more outrageous ones. So I don't know anyone, for example, who goes out in the streets every December 7th to celebrate Pearl Harbor Day by applauding the fascist leaders of Imperial Japan. But by our standards, it's exactly what we should be doing. The bombing of military bases in the U.S. colonies of Hawaii and the Philippines was entirely legitimate and praiseworthy, according to our standards. The Japanese leaders knew very well that B-17 flying fortresses were coming off the Boeing production lines, and they were surely reading the U.S. press and very familiar with the very public discussions in the United States at the time, explaining how these planes could be used to incinerate Japan's wooden cities in what was called a war of extermination, flying from Hawaiian and Philippine bases. And that's a far more powerful justification for anticipatory self-defense than anything conjured up by Bush and Blair and their associates and supporters. Well, fortunately, we're once again protected from such conclusions by the principled rejection of elementary moral truisms.